Welcome to another Lunch and Learn. This one is on benzene waste operations NESHAPs, otherwise known as BWON. Well, we'll get right into it. Again, my name is John Wigger. I'm leveraging 25 years of environmental compliance experience, working for a major oil company, BP, and now running this firm, Cadenza Environmental. So let me share my screen and we'll get right into this. Again, this is on benzene waste operations NESHAPs, and it is for a short lunch and learn session. So, introduction, what is it? The outline of this, we're going to go through an overview of the rule, what waste management units are and what the standards are, a little bit about delay of repair, some sampling, program maintenance, compliance tracking, and reporting. And of course, if you have more detailed questions about any of this, feel free to send me an email or give me a call. So first of all, just an overview of the rule. It's basically called subpart FFF or FF of the National Emission Standard for hazardous air pollutants, NESHAP, regulation 61.340. It's a unique rule in that it's kind of a cross between an air rule, a wastewater rule. Basically, it's intended to simply reduce the amount of benzene emissions from wastes that are associated with refineries, chemical plants, and coke byproduct recovery plants. Also want to mention that many BWON programs are under consent decrees that enhance the actual regulations, in the sense that in some cases some early adopters didn't adopt the rules as much as EPA would have liked, and EPA and many facilities entered agreements to enhance even above and beyond what the actual rules require. We'll get into a little bit of that later in this presentation. So what it means, overview of the rules, that the total annual benzene, that's the amount of benzene that's associated with waste at the facility. And it's called the TAB, which is an acronym for total annual benzene. You must calculate that. I'll get into that in a moment. And the other basic part of the rule is whether or not the waste and the waste streams, individual waste streams, are either controlled or uncontrolled. And those terms are not defined, but however, basically the terms generally refer to whether or not a waste stream is enclosed as to prevent emissions from escaping to the atmosphere. So if it's in a pipe and it's enclosed and there's no way for emissions to come off of that, that would be considered controlled, or a tank or any other particular type of unit, versus an open trough or a tank with an open top, or vented, a tank vented to the atmosphere. Those would be examples of uncontrolled facilities. So in general, the rule requires you to calculate what your total annual benzene is associated with the waste. And if your TAB is less than 1 megagram, that's 1,000 kilograms per year, you are essentially required to submit an initial report identifying all of these different waste streams, and then sending in a report saying, hey, we're below any action threshold here, so you don't have to really do anything else. If you have a total annual benzene between 1 and 10, then you also have to send in this initial tab identifying the waste streams and how much benzene you have associated with all these waste streams. But then you also have to submit that on an annual basis to certify that you are still below 10. And then basically you don't have to do anything else. But if you are above 10, which is the last category, you must submit this initial report. And many of these things were done back in 1993 when the rule was promulgated. But essentially, that is a requirement to submit this and then put controls into place to ensure that these waste streams are not allowed, in general, allowed to emit emissions to the atmosphere. And I'll go into much more detail about how that is, and that's most of the rest of this presentation. So if it's a tab greater than 10, as I had mentioned here, you have to basically comply with all the control requirements, and you have to do inspections and reports and all kinds of things to comply. And not any, but most of a major good-sized refineries are required to do this. Many chemical plants are also required to comply with this part of the regulation. That said, if you are required to comply with a 10 megagram or larger, then there's two major ways to comply. One or two major options that are basically able to choose. One's called the 2 megagram per year exemption. The other one is a treat to target, which is a 6 megagram, or otherwise sometimes known as 6BQ. I'll get into the details of what the differences are just a little bit later in this presentation, but know there are two ways to comply. Then I'll tell you what a waste is. It's defined in the rule in this case, and just know that it's different than what many of us are familiar with in terms of what a RCRA waste definition is. So in this case, waste is any material that is discarded or is being accumulated, stored, physically, chemically, biologically treated prior to being discarded, recycled, or even discharged. So it's different in the sense that even if it's going to be recycled back into a facility, into a process, in many cases, it still needs to comply with the control standards that are identified in the rule. So just know that there's a big difference. The other part about this is the waste, or the point of waste generation, and that is identifying at your facility where the actual point is in the process where the waste is generated. It's called the point of waste generation, or POG or POWG. You may hear people talk about, but it's exactly where it happens. So in many cases, here's an example where you have a process vessel going from one process vessel to another process vessel to another process vessel. But in the middle of that, you may have a water draw or some other waste materials coming off of that. And that then, at that point, would become the waste, meaning that it's being treated and managed physically, chemically, or thermally in some other unit prior to either being completely treated and or that material going back into the process somewhere else. But in that case, it's at that point and onwards, with a few exceptions that I'll get into, that it's required to be controlled or not allow the emissions to be allowed to go to the atmosphere. So the difference between the tab and the benzene quantity, I'd said I'd go back to this. The tab is a list of all the controlled or uncontrolled waste streams, basically a list of all of the different waste streams that are at a large facility. And that can be hundreds of places where wastes are generated. And then the benzene quantity used to track which compliance option we're using, either the 2 or the 6 megagram. I'll get into that in a moment. But I just want to make sure you understand there's a difference between the total annual benzene and then what you have to track for compliance for the different options. Under the 2 megagram option, essentially it's telling you that it is allowing, EPA had determined that if the benzene concentration in a wastewater benzene stream is less than 10 parts per million by weight in the wastewater stream, under the 2 megagram option, you can exempt that from having to have controls, ways of keeping air emissions from going to the atmosphere. But if you have waste streams that are above 10 parts per million, then those have to be controlled, meaning they have to be managed in a way that they are not allowed to emit to the atmosphere, except for, and here's the exception to that, you can have up to 2 megagrams that are allowed to go uncontrolled under that bucket. So in many cases, that can be quite advantaged for lots of very low benzene concentration waste streams to be able to be collected and managed in a non-controlled manner. As long as the ones that are higher in benzene concentrations, meaning above 10, those have to be controlled, except for again, a quantity that would add up to 2 megagrams. However, a different option was the 6 megagram, which treat to target, means all the uncontrolled benzene waste must be, all of the waste streams have to be controlled, all of them, no matter the concentration, up to except for 6 megagrams. So you got to basically think of it as 2 columns. You can have, it all needs to be controlled, except that you can have up to 6 megagrams that go uncontrolled. And there are no streams that would be, say, low in benzene concentrations that could go uncontrolled. You just have to account for everything. The other important thing is even waste that are shipped off site must be counted towards your tab and or the 6 megagram unless it's being managed off site under 6 megagram. It also means that all these organic waste streams that must also be controlled and treated to less than 10 parts per million. So if you've got some wastes that are very high in organics, those also have to be either controlled and or treated down to 10 parts per million, or unless it happens to be an organic waste that has very little benzene in it in the first place, and therefore it already meets the standard of being less than 10 parts per million. So this is just another way to describe what I had just described in terms of what has to be controlled or uncontrolled under these 2 differing options. So again, controlled means that the waste must be managed in a controlled waste management unit from the point of waste generation to either when it's either treated or recycled back to process. The control requirements for each type of waste management unit, and I'll get into those, are specified in the regulations. And the controls generally include seals and controlled vent systems, essentially assuring that either the any emissions that come off of the waste management units are either treated or adsorbed, but nothing is allowed, purposefully allowed, or not purposefully allowed to the atmosphere. This also includes a periodic inspection to ensure of that through what's called Method 21, no detectable emission monitoring, Method 21, or otherwise known sometimes as just VOC sniffing. So that's also required for all of the differing waste management units that are managing the waste. So periodic inspections are required for all the waste management units. And here's some examples of the different types of waste management units. There's oil water separator, drain systems, that's traditional sewer systems and or above ground waste piping, containers, including vac trucks and barrels and other kinds of things, tanks, of course, that are managing and holding waste, and even carbon adsorption systems used for venting some of the waste management units. All of these things require inspections. So tanks, for example, that store liquid that's considered to be a BWON waste, they require fixed roof covers. They must be equipped with closed vent systems. Anything, any emissions that come off of that have to either go to a flare or carbon canister or some other type of unit that destroys or otherwise assures that benzene is not allowed to the atmosphere. There are also some other kinds of ways to management under alternative standards for tanks, and by sealing it up, having floating roof tanks, other kinds of ways, and that's also specified in the regs, and it actually points to another reg called NSPS, and it has to be managed under some other tank rules. Containers also, portable waste management units, example of vac trucks, roll-off boxes, barrels, they must be equipped with.
They must be equipped with covers that operate with no detectable emissions. That's less than 50.
I'm going to stop this at the moment.
Openings must be.
Okay. So as I was saying, the vac trucks they all must be equipped with covers that operate with NDE, that VOC sniffing. Defined in the rules, anything that has to be less than 500 parts per million using method 21. Opening must be maintained in a closed and sealed position. These can't be left open. They are allowed to be open for waste loading, removal, inspection, and sampling, and some things like that. But otherwise, they must always be closed.
Maintained in a closed and sealed position and allowed to be open for loading, removal, inspection, and sampling.
So waste management units, also above ground lines, individual drain systems, the way it's specified in the rule, are used to convey waste streams from the process unit. These also have standards that must be met. Individual drain systems include process drains, junction boxes, above ground sewer lines, ancillary equipment. They must be enclosed and vented in order to work. Must be vented either to carbon canisters or flares or some other way to manage the emissions that would otherwise go to the atmosphere just for a sewer system to be able to work. Also, oil water separators, they're actually defined in the rule, and it's a pretty lengthy definition, but basically it includes the oil water separator and all the other ancillary equipment that is involved in the process. They must be equipped with fixed roof covers and routing all of the potential emissions into a control device. Again, have to be inspected and have no detectable emissions. They can also have floating roof covers. If that's the case, they have to meet the specifications that are listed in another rule called NSPS QQQ. It has to just meet certain specifications of how the floating roofs have to behave. Treatment processes also are defined in the rule, and they have to be designed and operated to achieve BWON treatment standards. Each waste management unit within the treatment train must have appropriate standards. So activated sludge pits, brine treatment units, strippers, all kinds of things might meet this category of how you actually do waste management the treatment of benzene. So control vent systems and control devices that are used to control the emissions from the regulated waste units. Closed vent systems, including the piping, the ductwork connections, they must, flow inducing devices almost route their emissions to a control device. A good example of that is carbon canisters used to vent these things to ensure that any benzene that's associated will be absorbed to the carbon before any air is released to the atmosphere. And of course, even those carbon canisters and stuff have to be monitored on a periodic basis. All of that's specified in the rule as well. One last thing too, under in here called the Enhanced Biological Treatment Unit, otherwise known in most rules, and I still don't understand why they called it this, but basically it's an activated sludge plant at a wastewater treatment plant, is that the activated sludge plant doesn't have to be controlled, because it's been demonstrated that as long as the benzene concentration measured regularly and on an annual basis, on an average annual basis, is less than 10 ppm benzene going into an activated sludge plant, that the biological material, the bugs in an activated sludge plant, will actually consume that benzene versus allowing it to escape to the atmosphere. It will be consumed biologically. So again, that's specified in the rule too, and you have to measure that periodically, measure the concentrations of benzene going into the activated sludge plant, or enhanced biological treatment unit as it's referred to in the BWON rule. So you have to do all of these things to ensure that none of these materials get to the atmosphere. But as you might expect, there are record-keeping requirements that are in the rule. You have to keep these records for a couple of years. In some cases, more if you've longer if you've signed up for a consent decree or something that might require longer maintenance of those records. But the records will include performance test, engineering calculations, inspection results, certifications, a whole lot of differing things that are required to just keep the records. Compliance tracking and reporting, as you might imagine, you also have to do quite a bit of reporting with this rule on a quarterly and annual basis. You have to identify annually the total annual benzene in all the streams. I had referred to that at the beginning of this presentation. Inspection documentations of all the drains and the tanks and the oil water separators and all that. You have to keep all of that information, the inspection documentation, treatment system documentation, and control device documentation. You have to keep all of that. And on an annual basis, you have to have a record that identifies each waste stream. Waste stream identification is made at each point of waste generation. Inspection results, calculations, measurements used to derive all of the different concentrations, and certification that the quarterly inspections were conducted, and even identify where there may have been short-term failures of equipment, and then the repairs that were associated with any failures associated with that. For example, if you're inspecting something and found a place where it had a concentration above 500 parts per million, for example, you have a specified amount of time, usually around 15 days, depending on the type of waste management unit, to actually make that repair. And in those cases, you have to make that repair, make sure that it's not leaking anymore, and then report what you've done there, that you had a failure and that you have repaired it. So with that, that is a very, very high level summary of what Benzene Waste Operations NESHAP is all about. If you have any questions, comments, or want anything more, give me a shout. Hope you found a little bit of information in this little lunch and learn presentation. Thanks.